Welcome everyone. In this module, we shall be talking about land reforms. Now, what shall we try to learn from this module? Firstly, we shall try to understand the relationship between farm size and productivity. After getting an idea of this relationship, we shall then move towards getting an idea about the importance of land reforms. After that, we shall focus on the land reform experiences in various developing countries. Okay, so let us start our analysis with the relationship between farm size and productivity. The first question that arises in this regard is, what is productivity? How to measure it? Now, generally, there are two measures of productivity. The first measure is known as total factor productivity. Now, what is total factor productivity? It can be explained in this way. Suppose there are two farms, farm A and farm B. Now, we say that farm A has higher total productivity compared to farm B if farm A produces more output using the same amount of input. That means farm A is using the same amount of input but producing higher amount of output. Second definition related to the measure of productivity is related to market efficiency. Now, in general, we talk about efficiency in terms of marginal revenue and marginal cost. To be more specific, we say that a farm is operating efficiently when it equates its marginal revenue with marginal cost. But in this case, we shall move towards an alternative definition. Here, we shall say that farm A is more efficient compared to farm B if it produces higher output per acre. So, this will be our operational definition. So, we shall consider productivity in terms of higher output per acre. So, output per acre will give us the measure of productivity. Now, given this definition, let us try to find out what determines the relationship between farm size and productivity. Now, when we talk about the relationship between farm size and productivity, we generally talk about three factors. The first factor is technology. It is said that for technological constraints, there is a certain minimum size below which land cannot be cultivated efficiently. Now, why this is so? As we all know that over the period, agriculture has become more and more mechanized. Now, for modern factors like tractors, harvesters, threshers, we know that they require a minimum size of land to operate efficiently. Now, even if we talk about traditional factors like animal power, like power of bullocks, we find that they are also indivisible. So, in that case, these traditional factors also require a minimum size of land to operate efficiently. So, what is our take? Higher farm size due to the technological reasons imply higher productivity. However, technology is not the only factor which determines productivity. Productivity is also determined by the presence of imperfect insurance market in agriculture. Now, as we all know that landlords and tenants, they are both risk averse. Now, in the absence of perfect insurance market, the risk averse landlords, they prefer a fixed rent type of contract. What about the tenants? They are also risk averse and therefore they prefer a fixed wage contract. So landlords force for fixed rent contracts, tenants force for fixed wage contracts. So this creates a conflict of interest between them. So any form of contract which is agreed between them creates some sort of efficiency related problem which has its adverse impact on productivity. Now what happens if the farm is small? If the farm size is small, then it is mostly cultivated by family laborers. So no such conflict exists between them. The third factor that determines the relationship between farm size and productivity is imperfect land market. Now, as we all know that in most of the developing economies, agriculture is characterized by the existence of unemployed labor. Now, let us suppose that there are two types of farm, a small farm and a large farm. The large farm employs hired laborers. On the other hand, the small farm employs family labor. Let us at first consider the case of a large farm. So the large farm employs hired laborers. So their cost per unit of labor will be equal to the market wage rate, say W. But what about the small farms? The small farms employ family labor. So in their case, the cost of labor should be the opportunity cost. Now, given the existence of unemployment in the economy, in this situation, the opportunity cost should be equal to the expected wage that could have been earned had the family labor got employed elsewhere. Now, how to calculate that expected wage? See, if we consider mu as the probability of getting employment, then the opportunity cost would be, in this case, mu into W instead of W. Now, we all know that the value of probability lies between 0 and 1. So, in this case also mu lies between 0 and 1. So, that means the opportunity cost mu into W must be less than equal to W, the existing market wage. Now, what will be its implication? To find the implication, let us consider this particular diagram. In this diagram, output per acre is represented in the vertical axis, while labor per acre is represented in the horizontal axis. The concave function represented in the diagram is actually the production function. Now, let us start with the large farm. Now, in the case of large farm, the total cost of production will be represented by the line W into L. Now, this farm will try to maximize its profit. Now, where will be the profit of the large farm maximized? The profit of the large farm will be maximized at that level where the slope of the production function will be equal to the slope of the positively sloped line WL. Now, in this case, this occurs at the employment level L and the corresponding level of output per acre will be Y. What about the small farm? For the small farm, the total labor cost will be mu WL instead of WL. Now, this is represented by the flatter positively sloped line, which is denoted here by mu WL. Now, for the small landowner, profit maximizing level of employment and output will be L1 and Y1. Now, if we compare between L and L1, we find that L1 is higher compared to L, and by similar reasoning, we find Y1 is higher compared to Y. That means the output per labor for the family cultivated small farm is greater than that of the large farm. In other words, this means that small farms are more productive compared to the large farms. So, what we get from it is that while point 1, that is the technology factor, tells that large farms should be more productive than the small farms, if we consider points 2 and 3, we find that smaller farm size leads to higher productivity. So, the net result is ambiguous. So, while the larger land size is preferred from the point of view of technology related advantages, both imperfect insurance market and imperfect labor market calls for smaller farm size. So, an ambiguity between the three effects. So, what will happen will ultimately become an empirical issue. So, at the empirical level, which effect dominates what? So, given this theoretical finding, we naturally move to our next question, that is, what is the empirical relationship between farm size and productivity? So, what we observe in reality. To find out the empirical relationship between farm size and productivity, let us at first look at the developed country experiences. Now, in case of developed countries, we find that the most productive farms are those who are owner occupied and predominantly use family labor. This is followed by the large mechanized and owner cultivated farms which employ wage labor. So, from this comparison, what we can say is that there exists some evidence of the existence of inverse relationship between farm size and productivity in the developed economies. Now, let us move to the case of developing country experiences. Now, let us start with the observation of Abhijit Sen, who conducted a research on West Bengal, a state of India. Now, what Sen found can be summarized in this way. For owner cultivated land, there exists a pure negative relationship between farm size and productivity. But what about the farms that have some amount of tenanted land? It was observed that for the farms with size between 0 to 3 acres, they are having the lowest level of productivity. So, the smallest farms are having the lowest level of productivity. However, inverse relationship was observed between farm size and productivity for farms having size of more than 3 acres. So, for the farms whose land size exceeds 3 acres, there is an inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. It was also observed that the productivity of owner occupied land is greater than the productivity of land under sharecropping. A similar research was conducted by Berry and Klein, but in this case, the coverage was higher. Berry and Klein covered 3 countries, India, Brazil and Pakistan. Now, they observed that there always exists an inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. At the same time, they also observed that the larger is the difference in size, the larger is the difference in productivity. Let us now move to the observation of ICRI SAT data on India. Now, the ICRI SAT data also observed an inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. So, from these observations, what do we get? There are 2 major findings. Number 1, there exists an inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. Number 2, the owner cultivated lands are more productive compared to the case of tenants. So, the owner cultivated lands are more productive compared to the lands which are tenanted. Now, if this is the case, then what is its policy implication? Okay, so in terms of policy, what can we say from this? Given the inverse relationship between farm size and productivity, one important policy conclusion will be that if we want to increase the productivity in agriculture in developing countries, we should introduce land reforms. Now, what is land reform? Briefly speaking, land reform is an institutional arrangement which, number 1, creates an upper limit on the land size. Number 2, it transfers land rights from large landowners to tenants or sharecroppers either without adequate compensation or with adequate compensation, but that compensation is not given by the beneficiaries. Now, what will be its possible benefits? Firstly, the decrease in land size will lead to increase in the level of productivity. Secondly, the ownership right to tenants will also lead to an increase in productivity. Now, in addition, it has an additional benefit. What is it? The right to ownership of land makes the landowners more creditworthy. So, land reform will also imply better access to credit. However, introduction of land reforms is not as easy as it seems. It requires tremendous political will from the government. At the same time, it requires willingness of the government to tackle the resistance of powerful lobbies. In certain countries, land reform was a result of political upheavals in the society. These happened in countries like Cuba, Japan, Korea and Taiwan. Now, what about the impact of land reforms? So far, a number of countries have undertaken land reforms. Now, if we look at them, we find that the impact of land reform has mostly been mixed. Land reform has been successful in certain regions like the countries of East Asia. On the other hand, in case of countries like Latin America, land reform is mostly a failure. So, the result is at most mixed. Now, why was it so? One major reason for the difference in experience is related to the difference in willingness of the government in undertaking land reforms. In case of East Asian countries, the government was more committed in undertaking land reforms. That was not so in the case of Latin American countries. At the same time, the ability of the government in tackling the pressure of powerful lobbies also appeared significant. Now, while the East Asian countries managed it more or less efficiently, in case of Latin American countries, even during land reforms, the Latin American countries were subsidizing their large landowners. So, these difference actually resulted into the major difference in their experience of land reforms. Now, this is what we have to tell about land reforms. Now, what we have learned so far? We started with finding out the relationship between farm size and productivity. What do we find? We find that the relationship between farm size and productivity is controlled by three factors: technology, imperfection in land and insurance markets. We then move to our second question, that is, what is the relationship between farm size and productivity? What we get is that empirically there exists an inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. We then move to the third question, why to introduce land reforms? Now, land reform should be introduced to take the advantage of the inverse relationship between land size and productivity. At the same time, land reform helps to increase the credit availability in the rural sector. We then addressed a next issue, that what have been the implication of land reforms. What we find is that the impact has been mostly mixed. Land reform has been successful in certain areas, certain countries, land reform has been a failure. So, this is what we have for this module. Thanks for watching.